History of a Teacher by Famous Fault. Chapter 22. Memories. Raphael, Rebecca, and Yugi had all traveled to England. Raphael had eventually admitted the fact that he couldn't join them in the wizarding world, even though it made him gloomy. Instead, he rented an apartment in London so that he could be close to them if they really needed his help. He reminded them often that they should ask him for help if the monsters from the shadows seemed to turn against them. Yugi wasn't worried about that. He had always treated his monsters with respect, and he knew that Rebecca had too, once she had learned her lesson. It was highly unlikely that they would join with Thames' enemies. Silently, they walked over the streets of London. This time both Yugi and Rebecca had taken precautions so they wouldn't be recognized. Yugi wore the black cape he hadn't used since the day he had arrived at Hogwarts for the first time. Rebecca wore a hoodie with a large hood, hiding most of her face. Raphael calmly walked beside them. There was no risk that he'd be recognized. It was terribly warm at King's Cross Station, unnaturally warm. Rebecca was the first to pull her hood down, but Yugi was still too afraid of being recognized to risk that. Instead, he hurried towards the platform, eager to get at sight again. Many wizard families were waiting outside the pillar, leaning towards platform 9 3/4. Many did their best to be inconspicuous, and most failed miserably. They stood out terribly, and it was obvious to anyone looking more closely that those families seemed to disappear, one by one. You wouldn't notice it directly, as new families arrived every second. Raphael raised an eyebrow. I thought you said that they did their best to remain hidden.
People tend to look around the things they don't want to see,
Rebecca remarked dryly. But still, Raphael said wide-eyed, this is impossible to miss. Yeah, you bet, a boy's voice said from behind them. Peter! Rebecca called out, genuinely happy to see him. She gave him a hug. How you holding up, Becca? He wondered quietly. I'll be fine, Rebecca said. Don't mention it. Peter frowned, but nodded. If that's what you want, I won't. If you change your mind, just say so. Tactfully, he turned away from Rebecca. Professor Muto? He looked down on the figure, desperately hiding his face with the black cape. Raphael chuckled at the title, receiving a light stamp on his arm from Rebecca. Yugi ignored his two companions and nodded. Yes. Did you have a good holiday, Mr. Lepard? Peter seemed to be unwilling to answer. That moment, two adults joined the group. Rebecca, Professor Muto, these are my parents. Peter told us. A heavy man with untamed blonde hair said, You have our condolences. Thank you, Yugi said, his voice low so he wouldn't attract too much attention. He did nothing else but talk about you two. When he talked at all. Peter's been gloomy during the entire holiday. He really destroyed the Christmas mood. Although I must say that I'm glad that he found a friend at all. He talks really highly of you, Rebecca. You too, Professor. He says that Hogwarts never has seen a teacher with such an impact on the students. Peter had turned all red as his mother blabbed on without thinking the least about her son. Yugi held back a harsh laugh at the woman's last words. They surely had had an impact on the students, but if it was a good one, was questionable. She continued as she turned to Raphael. You, at the other hand, I've never heard about. Who are you? Raphael looked down on the woman with a glare that could have turned Medusa to stone. I'm Raphael, Rebecca's guardian now that her grandfather died.
Oh my, how nice of you. It must have come like a shock for you to find out that she was a witch. It's really good of you not to condemn her for that. It would be awful to be rejected one's legacy because of such horrible opinions. Yugi interrupted her when he realized that she could go on quite a while. Excuse me, I think we have to go now so we don't miss the train. Oh yeah, she just said absent-mindedly. Peter, let us know if anything interesting happens. She gave them all a huge smile and waved them off as they one by one disappeared through the wall. Raphael shook his head as he watched, and Yugi knew that he wanted to follow. Have they absolutely no idea what's going on?
Rebecca wondered as soon as they had moved out of the way from the other people coming through the pillar. Peter shook his head. No, I never told them about the war. They wouldn't allow me to go to Hogwarts if they knew. I'm not the only Muggle born who doesn't tell about the war. Our parents are more easy at mind not knowing. Yugi pulled his head down, glad to be away from the people who'd recognize him as the king of games. Don't you think it's more fair on them if you told them? They should be aware of the danger which you surround yourself with so they can be prepared. Peter shrugged. I just don't want them to worry. Besides, I'm surprised that Mom could keep it a secret that I go to a school for wizards. It'll be hard for her to keep it a secret that we're only moments away from a complete war. I see, Yugi said. Now the two of you should board before you miss the train. Hurry up. I'll see you at school. Yugi went to the teacher's compartment and received condolences from several of the teachers there, but mostly they left him alone, and he was grateful for it. The first Monday after the holidays passed by without much drama. There was spoken about the letter that had arrived during the Christmas feast, and Yugi noticed that several students walked up to Rebecca to offer her their condolences. Yugi, too, received condolences from students during his classes, but nothing happened during the day. Yugi's teaching wasn't affected the least by the events, and he taught them like he always had. He told the fifth years about the nuclear bombs and their effect on the people living in the area nowadays. He told them the story of the girl with 1,000 paper cranes. "Let me tell you a story," he told the fifth years that Monday morning. "I already told you what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I said numbers and named places. I explained to you how they work, but not one of you can relate to what truly happened. Do you know why they number pigs rather than give them names on a pig farm?" Hermione raised her hand. "So you won't get emotionally attached to them." Yugi nodded. "The same moment you give something a name, you get attached to it. It's harder to kill something with a name. When a police negotiates with someone who holds a hostage, they say the name of the hostage as often as possible, because an unconscious awareness of the hostage's life is created in the mind of the kidnapper. It will become much harder for the kidnapper to kill his hostage. Same thing with history. None of you can relate to the impact of the 2 nuclear bombs dropped on Japan. I can tell you an approximate number of how many people died during the detonation in the next few days, but it won't really mean anything to you." Yugi walked forward until he stood among the V-formatted benches. "Still today, people die from the effect the nuclear bombs had. 48% of all the deaths that occur due to leukemia is said to be the effect of the radioactive radiation that doesn't disappear. The people that were anywhere near that place didn't get old, and their children are often damaged in one way or another. They are born misshapen or with psychological problems. These 2 bombs will affect every living thing in that area for several million years from now." "Magic can't even do that," Millicent Bulstrode said wide-eyed. "No, thank God it can't," Yugi said, and shuddered at the thought alone. "It's partly these bombs that would make that. If there ever would be a war between wizards and muggles, muggles would win. That's something you should think about, all of you." Yugi looked Malfoy in the eyes. It hadn't been up until now that Yugi realized it. If Voldemort would make his dream come true and put every muggle at the feet of the wizards, there would be an all-out war, most likely including nuclear weapons.
"People kill what they fear,"
Atem said. "It would destroy the earth," Yugi said and shuddered again. "In 1943, a girl was born in Hiroshima. She was 2 years old when little boy struck down on the town. The girl named Sadako was at home at the moment and only a mile from Ground Zero. Sadako was blown out the window due to the bomb's strength. Her mother ran out to find her, and miraculously enough, Sadako was still alive. It was said that Sadako was born to run. It was her favorite thing to do, and she blew people away with her speed. Running was her dream. However, on the 21st of February in 1955, she was hospitalized and diagnosed with leukemia. Sadako had a friend named Chizuko. August the same year, Chizuko came with a paper crane folded from golden paper. She reminded Sadako of the ancient Japanese legend that states that a person who folds 1,000 paper cranes will be granted one wish by the gods. The golden crane would be the first one of 1,000. Sadako started folding it once, but soon ran out of paper. Her friends and family collected paper for her, and Sadako scrounged up material from the other patients' get-well gifts and medicine wrapping. Her older brother promised Sadako that he would hang every crane she made from the ceiling of her hospital chamber. The golden crane, however, stayed next to Sadako. She died a morning in October 1955 at the age of 12, surrounded by her family. A popular version of the story is that Sadako died having folded 644 cranes. But the truth is that she folded around 1,500 cranes before she died, and her friends kept folding them for her after she died. Nowadays, there is a statue of Sadako holding the golden crane she received from Chizuko. Most of the girls sat with tears in their eyes. Tracy leaned on Dean's shoulder, but when Yugi was done, she raised a hand. "Did any of your family members die due to the nuclear bombs?" Yugi shook his head. "No, not that I know of. Grandpa was in Egypt at the time, working as a freelance among archaeologists. You could almost call him a tomb robber," Yugi added with a smile.
"A tomb robber?"
Atem wondered, having never looked at it from that point of view. "Well, yes, he did after all take the Millennium Puzzle from your tomb. He might not have sold it for his own gain, but it is and remains robbing.
Although you saved his life, perhaps Grandpa took it as a sign of your approval, Yugi suggested. I don't remember saving his life, Atem said, slightly displeased. But I don't mind taking it. Perhaps it was fate. Considering I solved the puzzle? Yeah, probably. It was at older age that he actually started working with real archaeologists. It's during that time that he met Arthur Hawkins, Rebecca's grandpa. Yugi's voice trailed off. The sudden silence in the room was slightly awkward, but Tracy broke it, more for Yugi's sake than because she wanted to know.
Then how did you meet Rebecca?
Yugi's smile returned. It's surprising that no one of you has asked like that earlier. You must have wondered. Several nods came from the figures. The reason Grandpa went to Egypt was because he was interested in games. He and Arthur shared a particular like for a certain card game played long ago in ancient Egypt. Yugi didn't miss that Harry and Hermione exchanged a look. Yugi backed up and sat down on his desk. As a sign of their friendship, Arthur gave Grandpa his rarest card. However, Rebecca wasn't aware of that story. 8 years ago, Rebecca walked up to us after Grandpa had been newly released from the hospital and accused him of being a thief. She herself was only 8 at the time. She challenged Grandpa, but since he had just come from the hospital, neither I nor my friends wanted him to duel. So instead, I challenged Rebecca. I lost, but after the game, Arthur walked in and explained everything to his granddaughter. The two of them left for home that much later. Approximately 2 years later, though, Arthur made a discovery that brought him back to Japan, and Rebecca went with him. We got to know each other during that time mostly. Jonochi, Anzu, Honda, and I spent that summer with Arthur and Rebecca at a lake in America. Yugi shrugged. I guess we assumed that we'd see each other again after my friends and I left for home, but then the tomb collapsed and I ran away. Rebecca attended the funerals. I did not. I'm seldom as surprised as I was when Minerva brought Rebecca into my classroom. You have much to tell, Dean commented in a low voice. Monday evening, Harry went with his feet dragging behind him to the dungeons. He was accompanied by Tracy, who had to pass by Snape's office to get to her common room. Anyway, no one who passed them found it weird anymore to see the Slytherin girl walk with people not from her house. She was nearly always with Dean, and since most people knew that Dean got along with Harry, Hermione, and Ron, it wasn't that odd that Harry and Tracy small-talked when going in the same direction. Tracy was telling Harry that Snape wasn't such a bad teacher if you did as he told you and succeeded quickly. And if you don't succeed? Harry wondered a bit sourly.
Tracy shrugged. He's not a patient teacher, but the things he can teach are amazing. Good luck,
she added as Harry reached Snape's office. Thanks, he said gloomy and took a deep breath before he knocked on the door and entered. The office was shadowy and the walls were completely hidden by stuffed shelves. There were glass jars with ingredients that Harry preferably didn't think about and potions. In a cupboard in the corner, there were lots of ingredients that were more commonly used in potions. On the desk stood a stone basin that Harry recognized at once as Dumbledore's pensieve. Shut the door behind you, Potter, Snape's cold voice said. Hesitatingly, Harry did as he was told, and he felt like he stopped the last light from entering the room despite the lit candles. Snape pointed at the chair opposite his desk, and they sat down. Well, Potter, you know why you were here, Snape said. Although a slight adjustment has been made since our last meeting, Professor Muta will now be assisting us under our sessions. What? Harry said, in lack of a better way to express his surprise. From a shadowy corner, a short figure stepped into the light. I told the headmaster not to expect too much from me, but I'll do my best. The headmaster has asked me to teach you occlumency. I can only hope that you prove more adept at it than at potions, Snape continued, ignoring Professor Muta's words. Right, Harry said tersely. This might not be an ordinary class, Potter, Snape said, and his eyes narrowed malevolently, but I am still your teacher, and you will therefore call me Sir or Professor at all times. Professor Muto frowned, but did not comment. Yes, sir, Harry said to please Snape. Harry listened closely as Snape explained what occlumency and legitimacy were, and did his best to question him on whatever he said. Harry couldn't help but notice that Professor Muto almost looked amused at the interaction between Snape and Harry himself. Despite that it was slightly annoying to be looked upon by the history teacher, who stood aside in a dark corner of the room, Harry mostly focused on Snape and came to one conclusion. Voldemort can read minds. You have no subtlety, Potter, Snape said, his eyes glittering. You do not understand the fine distinctions. It is one of the shortcomings that makes you such a lamentable potion maker. He took a pause before continuing. Only muggles speak of mind reading. Snape threw Professor Muto a glare, but the Japanese just returned it with a faint smile and a raised eyebrow. The mind is not a book to be opened at will and examined at leisure. Thoughts are not etched on the insides of skulls to be perused by any invader. The mind is a complex and many-layered thing, Potter. Or at least most minds are. Snape smirked, and Professor suddenly put a hand over his eyes and lowered it again. Harry could only imagine how the history teacher had to feel like in this room loaded with hostility. It is true, however, that those who have mastered legilimency are able, under certain conditions, to delve into the minds of their victims and to interpret their findings correctly. The Dark Lord, for instance, almost always knows when someone is lying to him. Only those skilled at occlumency are able to shut down those feelings and memories that contradict the lies, and so can utter falsehoods in his presence without detection. That sounded like mind reading to Harry, no matter how Snape put it, and Harry didn't like it. Snape continued explaining the importance of being able to know occlumency, and that Voldemort now knew about the bond he shared with Harry, which made that the normal rules of occlumency didn't count. Professor Muto followed the conversation closely without saying a word. "And it might try and make me do things?" "Sir?" Harry asked. "It might," Snape said, cold and unconcerned. "Which brings us back to occlumency." "And more than just occlumency," Professor Muto interrupted his colleague. "As Professor Snape already told you, it's only those exceptionally skilled at occlumency that can keep him out. For you, it will be even harder considering he already has a gateway in your mind. Tell me, were you conscious of your own body when your mind entered that of the snake?" Harry shook his head. "No, I was asleep." Professor Muto frowned and took some steps forward. "I didn't think so. However, you weren't asleep. When your mind leaves your body falls into a state that can be compared to sleeping, but you are awake. The danger with going into someone's mind is that you have to leave your own body. Now, your mind will be back in less than a split second if someone would harm your physical body, and that's why people don't see it that way. Only the conscious parts of your mind are transferred into that of the other person, because you still have a need of a breathing body, and something has to keep you breathing. But do you understand my point?" Harry nodded. "I think so. Now, Voldemort," the Japanese started, only to be interrupted by Snape. "Don't speak his name," he hissed. "I will speak his name," Professor Muto said, and looked Snape in the eyes. "There is only one living creature in this world who I despise more than Voldemort, and that's why I will speak his name whenever I feel the need." Harry stared wide-eyed at the history teacher. As far as Harry knew, no one but McGonagall and Dumbledore dared speaking to Snape like that. "All right, Voldemort is not aware of the danger that hides in leaving his own body. The reason he is not aware of that is because most people only think about protecting themselves and never considered harming him while he invades their mind." Snape blinked and looked terrified. "Are you suggesting that you can harm a person's mind inside your own?" Professor Muto shook his head. "No, you can't harm a person in one's mind. You can, however, trap a person in your own soul. If you dare." Both Harry and Snape were staring at the Japanese in disbelief, and Harry realized that this was just as new to Snape as it was to him. "Impossible!" Snape spat enraged. "Not quite," Professor Muto said with a faint smile. "Picture your soul as a room. The inside of that room mirrors who you are as a person. It contains memories, it shows qualities, it shows what bothers you. It is you. If you have access to a person's soul, you can get to know them as well as you know yourself. People who are in deep shock tend to withdraw to their soul's room and stay there, unreachable for the outside world. Like every room, it has a door, and outside that door there is a hallway. The harder it is to reach that person's soul, the longer the hallway. The way that room looks changes with time, just like you do yourself." "That sounds as if you've been there," Harry said and cocked his head. "I've been in my own," Professor Muto said quietly. "Have you ever seen your own?" Harry shook his head. "Not that I know of." "That's a disadvantage," the young man sighed. "Dumbledore is aware of the possibility to lock someone away within your soul's room, although he does not master it himself. He hopes I could teach you to do so." "But then, how do you lock someone away?" Harry wondered curiously, while Snape was still comprehending what Professor Muto had said. "To be able to do that requires a thorough insight in how your room looks like, how large it is, and where the dark corners are. When you know it that well, you can start securing it against intruders, mainly by putting up traps. You should see an invading mind as a miniature version of that person. It could simplify things. Now, if the intruder walks into the trap you created, and you created it with some sort of skill, then that person will be unable to leave. Ever. Like Severus said, the mind is a many-layered thing. So is your soul.
That room is only the summary, filled with his symbolic objects to represent your core. Such a trap expels an invader to your deepest layer, and they won't be able to take themselves away from there, in addition to the fact that they'll be harmless. In your soul's room, you have the advantage. In your mind, you do not. In your mind, you're at the mercy of the legitimist.
How do you know this? Snape asked, rather unfriendly. Aren't you a muggle?
There we come to the second part that is crucial to mastering this technique, Professor Muto said, not the least bothered by Snape. This isn't part of any wizarding magic. This is far older and should have been long forgotten. There was a lot Harry wanted to say in that moment when the bits and pieces fell into place, but he was restrained by Snape. No matter how much Harry's distrust for the history teacher had increased in the last seconds, he didn't want to give him away in front of Snape.
What exactly are you going to teach me? Harry wondered, unable to keep the distrust out of his voice.
Professor Muto noticed it and raised an eyebrow. Probably nothing. It craves a lot of discipline to be able to place traps in your own soul. Occlumency is your priority. If it shows you are talented in occlumency, I'm going to try to teach you how to reach your own soul. Let me warn you, today there is only one person in this world who is able to trap invaders in his soul. The likeliness of you being able to learn it is close to zero. You see, it's not magic, it's pure willpower. Even Muggles could do it if anyone was strong, brave, and disciplined enough for it. You must realize that facing your inner self is among the most frightening things to do.
I doubt that Potter will have the ability to learn something like that, Snape said, scornful, and Harry glared at him.
Snape drew his wand from an inside pocket and raised it as Harry danced. He put it against his head and drew out a silvery white substance that neatly fell into the basin on the desk. He repeated that 2 times and then put the basin on a shelf out of their way, without giving a hint on why he did what he was doing.
Stand up and take out your wand, Potter, Snape commanded. You may use your wand to attempt to disarm me or defend yourself in any way you can think of. Harry didn't like the sound of that. And what are you going to do?
I am about to break into your mind, Snape said softly. We are going to see how well you can resist. I have been told you that you have already shown aptitude in resisting the Imperious Curse. You will find that similar powers are needed for this. Brace yourself now. For 1 split second, time stopped as Harry looked straight into the pair of amethyst eyes, and he knew that his history teacher could see the fear in Harry's eyes. A fear coming from that knowledge that there was no chance that Harry would be able to keep Snape out. He wasn't even given time to prepare himself. And in that second, a similar fear arose in Professor Muta's eyes. Harry had heard the prophecy, seen the cause, and knew more about the teacher than most of the people at Hogwarts. The 5th years had been present when Umbridge was left screaming in the forest, and there was something more Harry did not want Snape to see. He just couldn't remember what it was. All these secrets would be wrecked by the bat-like man who shouted, "Legilimens!" Without having a chance to summon resistance, images started racing before his eyes. They were like a flickering film, blinding him, and so vivid that they were all he could see. It started with Dudley's new bicycle and went on to Ripper, the bulldog who chased him up a tree. But then he saw something he couldn't recall. Or actually, he could, now that he saw it, but he had completely forgotten. He was standing in something that seemed to be a van. For some reason, everyone around him was naked. There were women, children, and men. Most of them were crying. Harry noticed that he himself was naked too, and he too cried. He knew death was waiting for him. How come he didn't remember this scene from his life? He knew Snape was infiltrating his memories, but this wasn't one of his memories. Was it? The van started moving, and although his present self did his best to remember, he couldn't. It was a vague and distant memory that, for some reason, was crystal clear in his mind. His memory self was shaking and looking around. Children hugging their mothers or fathers, wives holding their husbands, people hugging themselves. He was shaking in fear and waited. What was he waiting for? Carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide! The same instant he remembered, and his present self started to scream, and his past self started to see things blurry, while people sunk to the ground one by one, while others screamed and desperately tried to get out. But no one of them could get out. They would choke or be poisoned by the carbon monoxide. The flickering film did, however, not stop with that image. It went from one little bit of memory to the next. He watched as Neville was taken away by soldiers and shot while everyone was watching because he opposed them. Tracy taking care of a small child, burning with fever. Harry saw soldiers walk up to him as he was surrounded by houses with smashed windows and dead bodies laying around him. One soldier raised his gun and then the image went black as he heard a loud bang.
He saw himself taking a pair of scissors and starting to cut the long hair of an unknown woman, while next to him Ron did the same thing to Hermione without reacting at all. And then he saw the thing that shocked Harry most of all. He himself was laying on the ground, giving the images a weird kind of angle, and he had never been so tired before. All he had to do was close his eyes. Dead people laid in piles around him, covering almost every inch of the ground. The soldiers were nowhere to be seen. They seemed to have vaporized. Then a moving person entered Harry's vision. Even with an image as unclear as that one, there was no doubt who roamed the fields of corpses. Walking slowly, arms hanging at his sides, was no one less but Professor Muto himself. Although something was different about him, he looked taller and his posture was more self-assured, even though his shoulders hung with sorrow. He didn't seem to be aware of the fact that Harry was still alive, but when he came closer, the young man bent down and took Harry's hand. When Harry looked up, he stared straight into a pair of crimson eyes. "Ah!" he screamed, and a sharp pain went through his knee. The office reappeared, and Harry was on the floor, tears streaming down his face and breathing heavily as the memories of what he had seen partly returned. They didn't make sense to him, as he died in them several times, and people he knew died more than once too. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling, the fear, and the horror. "What was that?" Snape demanded to know slowly, with horror in his voice. Did you see what I saw?" Harry asked, not even doing an attempt to get off his knees, but covering his face with his hands. "Most of it," Snape said, his hands shaking. "You have lost control." Harry removed his hands and looked at Professor Muto, who was standing frozen in the very same corner as in which he started. His eyes were amethyst, as always, and he, too, had tears in them. Snape was also looking at the young teacher, and Harry stood up, still staring into the eyes of his history teacher. He had no idea what was going on, but Harry was quite sure that the person in front of him could tell him that. Then Harry looked at Snape, who seemed equally shocked by the memories he had found in his student's mind, as the student had been himself. To Harry, everything appeared to be very distant, as if he was looking at the two frozen men from behind thick glass, not entirely clear. He started shaking his head as he walked backwards, reaching out with his hand on the doorknob without having to let go of the room with his gaze. Harry couldn't find words and shook his head viciously to get rid of all the memories that were tumbling into his brain without caring about any kind of chronological order. "Go." Harry turned around and opened the door as quickly as he could. When he slammed it shut behind him, he saw Professor Muto sliding down to the floor with his back against the wall, before the black door took him away from Harry's vision like a wild animal devouring its prey.